Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on payer services trends. You are in the right place and you should be starting to see the slides. We're going to just pause here for another minute or so and let other people join, and then I'll be back here with you to go over our topics and agenda for the day. All right, thank you everybody for joining us. I think we have a critical mass of people that were registered that have been able to log in. Like I said earlier, thank you so much for joining us for payer services trends, market drivers, key transactions, and legal issues. Amber and I are looking forward today to talking to you about some of these items, and hopefully some of you are new to this space, and then we also have some veterans here as well. As I mentioned, Amber, Walsh, and I will be presenting on this topic. We both lead our Payer Services Working Group here at McGuireWoods. We spend a significant amount of time in this subsector, and I know many of you all do as well. Although I'm keenly aware that there are some people on the attendee list that are likely the first time that they're really delving into this sector deeply, and there may be some things that people are hearing for the first or maybe second or third time. One thing about the payer services industry that drove us to want to put on this webinar is the continual increase in interest. We continue to get questions from healthcare investors, strategic businesses, and then, of course, payer services providers themselves about this opportunity, specifically as people are starting to invest in areas that are not healthcare services or other FDA-regulated industries. So thank you so much for being here with us. Most of the people here have some type of connection with McGuireWoods in potentially one of our other subsectors. But for those of you who aren't familiar with us yet, McGuireWoods is an international law firm with 24 offices and more than 1,000 attorneys worldwide. Amber and I both sit in McGuireWoods' healthcare group at the firm, and we focus on a variety of different subsectors. Payer services is one of them, of course. And we sit alongside more than 55 attorneys who actually spend about 100% of their time on healthcare issues. And then many of you know McGuireWoods has a really committed investment in healthcare. So we have another 100 attorneys or so that spend a significant amount of time with us, but don't technically sit in our healthcare department, which you all may have interacted with from time to time, whether it be tax, debt finance, private equity, and of course others. Before we get started into the substance, I just wanted to hit a couple of administrative items. So first, all of you should be able to see the Q&A box. If you have any questions as we go through the webinar, please feel free to put those questions into the Q&A box. We'll try to hit them as we go along. If we aren't able to hit your question, we will reach out after the webinar to try to close the loop with you. And as always, if things come up in your business from a payer services perspective that you'd like to talk about, bounce around, feel free to reach out to Amber and I. We'd love to do that with you. We do that off the clock with people all the time. Don't hesitate to reach out. And then for those of you who are investors on this phone, I just wanted to include a quick plug here to join us for our annual Healthcare and Private Equity Conference in Chicago. Many of you all have attended it in the past. This year it is moving dates. We are moving to May. So it will be May 8th and 9th at the Ritz in Chicago. We would love to have, of course, any of you. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started into the agenda. So we're going to cover some key topics here today. We're going to spend some time talking about what is payer services and what is it not. That's going to be repetitive for some of you on the call, but also I think helpful refresher with some key points to think about, some key market drivers. The next thing is we're going to talk about each of the key subdivisions of payer services. People divide payer services up in a lot of different ways, but these seem to be some consistent buckets that we see within thought leadership and other organizations also talking about the subsector. So we're going to talk about ancillary benefit management, IT services for payers, of course, medical review services, and cost containment. And as you will see as we go through the discussion, the legal and market issues impacting each of these subdivisions are both the same and different as we go through some of these subdivisions. So you'll see that it's very common that there are singular companies that have available opportunities in each of these different subdivisions or a subset of them. So you'll see there is a little bit of market overlap there. And then, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the key legal issues that we see coming up in each of these subsectors. There are some diverse laws that are implicated in payer services that are not always implicated in other traditional healthcare services subsectors. So we're going to hit on those. Some of those may not be as familiar to you if you haven't invested or operated for a significant period of time in this space. So with that, let's talk about a little bit of an overview. So a lot of people are using buzzwords like payer services, pharma services, cost containment, lots of different elements of healthcare that have been in vogue lately. It is one of the fastest growing subsectors in healthcare. We've seen in the last 5 years a significant uptick in activity. The activity this year has been a little flatter than in some previous years, although the interest has remained very high. So we expect next year to continue to see a significant amount of payer services transactions that are in the market. Generally, as it sounds, payer services is services or solutions to payers. So to the extent that there is a company that is predominantly targeting its service to payers to solve a significant issue that payers are having, whether it be cost containment, accurate medical record reviews, IT challenges as the administrative burden continues to increase, those are all going to fall within this bucket of services that are being provided to make payers function more effectively and make them be able to serve their consumers, often employers or individual patients, better. Like we've talked about, there's often segmentation of these solutions. That is done predominantly for administrative ease, right? To streamline the work that's being done at the payers, to improve efficiencies, and then ultimately to grow earnings for the payers, which are obviously mammoths in the healthcare space as a whole. One thing I like to touch on, especially for people that have worked in the healthcare services space in the past and in the FDA-regulated space in the past, is what is payer services not? Obviously, it is increasingly on trend for payers to be bleeding into the healthcare services space, but payer services are not healthcare services. That means they are often not regulated by the same laws as healthcare services laws, although there are some crossover on things like telemedicine, but it is generally not circumstances in which payers are providing any kind of healthcare themselves. Rather, it's aimed at the administration of the payer's business. So that's just a quick overview of what it is and what it isn't. We've already touched on several of these, but we'll hit them quickly. The different acquirers in the space look a little different than in healthcare services or in FDA-regulated industries. We often see the strategic acquirers are payers, healthcare IT companies. So those are players we don't see as frequently in the healthcare services space. We also see more traditional acquirers like private equity funds and other capital providers in the space pretty commonly as well. And there's a lot of drivers that are driving the interest in payer services, but these on your screen are just a few. The primary is payer administration is continuing to get more complicated. As healthcare and technology gets more complicated and the process to provide care gets more complicated, so does the claims administration side with respect to payers. There also is still a really fragmented industry there are not a significant number of payer services companies that dominate significant percentages of the space. It's still very regional. It is still very subdivision specific based on the type of service that's provided, although we are seeing some greater consolidation. And there is a desire to continue expanding and providing more services. So you will see there are companies that started out, for example, in cost containment that are now moving into medical review services. So there's a significant amount of de novo growth, too, that's spurring the interest in this space. But we'll talk about these in a little bit greater detail under each of the specific subsectors. As we talk about some of the additional subsectors, we thought it might be helpful just to put in a graphic that Provident Healthcare Partners actually pulled together that shows some of the solutions that the payer services companies are providing in each of these subdivisions. And we're going to talk about all the subdivisions in greater detail, so I won't go into them here, but this just gives you a flavor to be able to know what we're going to talk about. And then here are some of the major M&A activity as well in each of these spaces. There's obviously a significant amount of additional M&A activity under each of these subsectors, which we're going to talk about in greater detail during our webinar here. But this just gives you a flavor of some of the names that you have likely heard and dealt with in the subsector. So with that, Amber, I'm going to turn it over to you to go into our very first subsector, ancillary benefit management.
Thank you, Kayla. So as I prepare to talk about the first subsector, ancillary benefit management, I'll just mention a few more thoughts that are really relevant to thinking about a particular company and whether or not it fits in, or which subsector it fits into. The lines are very blurred. There's a lot of overlap between the subsectors. And we'll get into that in a minute, but as you can imagine, ancillary benefit managers are often charged with cost containment by the payers that they are serving. Likewise, there's an IT solution for a lot of these different companies. That also goes towards cost containment. So putting a particular company in just one of these subsectors is not always very clean. In fact, it is no clearer and harshly delineated than, frankly, these days providers and payers are. A lot of the opportunity, a lot of the attention on the payer services space surrounds the blurred lines between providers and payers, and what is becoming more and more a belief that payers and providers have a joint responsibility to serve patients, members, beneficiaries. Those are all the same person. You are a patient, a member, and a beneficiary, and more of an obligation on the patient, member, beneficiary to be educated and help get the right health care. So these blurred lines are creating a lot of these opportunities and a lot of the angst, but excitement for payers in how to fulfill those responsibilities and provide these solutions. So let's start with ancillary benefit management. As I'm sure most of you know who are on here, ancillary benefits are really a secondary coverage that is supplemental to your primary health insurance coverage. And it typically covers miscellaneous medical expenses. It can be ambulance transportation, translation services, drugs in some cases, certain supplies like in the wound care context, bandages, et cetera. That's typically ancillary benefits. And there's a lot of crossover in this topic between ancillary benefits management and pharmacy benefits management, or now we have dental benefits management. There's similar philosophies behind each. The best ABMs do more than just connect members to the benefits, but are actively involved in quality evaluation, actually contracting for the services provided, ensuring access to care and that clinical decision making is done timely. And of course, that's the view of what it should be, what the best should be, but that's really what this space is about. And the market drivers and the opportunities when it comes to ancillary benefit management companies, largely driven by consumer awareness and demand for these ancillary benefits. Consumers want these on a pre-tax basis. And employers are more and more willing to invest in providing these additional benefits in a competitive labor market like we have seen for the past several years. Another driver is aging population resulting in expanded use of specialty care. I think we've all seen the statistics about the dominant portion of the U.S. healthcare spend that goes towards specialty care. The CDC's most recent reports are 90% of the U.S. healthcare spend goes to chronic disease management and mental health, which of course is dominantly provided by specialty care. And there's a very clear nexus between specialty care and these ancillary benefits. Additional driver, payer awareness of how proper specialty care can also positively impact population health. And Kayla's going to talk about that a little bit later, population health, and some of her segments she'll cover. But you can see how these things are related. And then very similarly, ancillary benefit managers have a role in loss prevention. And that's something that all of these segments really touch on, is the payer's constant need focus on loss prevention as well. Some of the key transactions in this space, these transactions have been the higher dollar big players. So one that got a lot of attention in 2022, and then the proverbial carve-outs that came in 2023, were managed care giant Centene sold off Magellan RX to Prime Therapeutics for $1.35 billion, and also sold off Magellan Specialty Health to Evolent Health for $750 million. Those were both spin-offs after Centene had acquired Magellan's larger behavioral health platform, for $2.2 billion at the beginning of that same year. So there's a lot of movement on those benefit management components that time in the behavioral health space. McKesson has had a lot of benefits management acquisitions. One of the more recent ones, also in the pharmacy benefit management space, $875 million acquisition of RX Savings Solutions, which is a price transparency tool on top of a benefits management company. There are a lot in that really high dollar, upper middle market or high market cap transactions. There are some more in the lower middle market, but we see that a little bit more in some of the other segments that we're going to talk about. Some of the key legal issues in this area. Let me first just mention a few laws that are really applicable to all of these payer services subsectors, not just to ancillary benefit management. Antitrust laws. There has been some significant FTC focus on the PBM space, the pharmacy benefit management space, both monopolization, but more so vertical integration with their relationships with pharmacies. But on a more granular level, on a more day-to-day basis, just like other employers, ancillary benefit management companies deal with workforce non-compete issues, some of the same things that all employers face. Obviously, data privacy and security is a very, very high opportunity but high risk component of a benefit management organization. Kayla will talk about that a little bit more later, but protecting PII, that personally identifiable information like social security numbers, driver's license, et cetera, and PHI, protected health information, it's really hypercritical for all of these segments. Beneficiary inducement laws that typically on the state basis, but there's some federal considerations as well that might surprise you. You might think, well, how can beneficiary inducement laws impact or be implicated by the activities of ancillary benefit management companies? And more as these lines are blurred, as ABMs are involved more and more in structuring solutions to change patient/beneficiary behavior, these laws can also be implicated. Implicated doesn't mean that it makes their role illegal. It just means these are additional things that we as McGuireWoods lawyers think about when we are diligencing or helping these companies to operate. And then, of course, IP protection. That's something we don't talk about a lot on healthcare webinars, but something we can't forget. And all of these segments have a very, very heavy and valuable intellectual property component that's really important. I'll mention state licensure and registration laws. It's as Kayla mentioned, it is a different regulatory body that regulates ancillary benefit managers. Tends to fall under Department of Insurance when it is regulated, as opposed to the Department of Health or Boards of Medicine. And it's really helpful for really all of these payer services subsectors to understand that while they are not payers, their primary customer base is payers. So understanding payers' own limitations and obligations can be really, really helpful to a successful business strategy for the ABMs or the cost containment providers to be able to properly interface with the payers to make sure that you are not presenting solutions that are going to be intolerable for them. So I mention this because the payers themselves, the insurers, tend to be much more heavily regulated than the benefit management companies, but it's still important to kind of understand the overarching regulatory scheme. And then, of course, likewise, Affordable Care Act, ERISA, employee benefits considerations. These are all things that impact the day-to-day operations of this particular segment of payer services. So I'll move on now and talk about IT services. And that is a really broad topic. Of all four of the segments that we're talking about here today, this is the single broadest in definition, and a lot of things can fit within IT services. So we'll just touch on a few. Market drivers, in addition to all the ones that we've already talked about for other segments, you also have the evolving labor market with worker shortages and remote work opportunities. It creates both challenges and opportunities, and IT solutions for payers can certainly help with that. There's an increasing consumer demand for increasingly sophisticated mobile tools. We as consumers have expectations of our insurance companies and of our providers now that we didn't have even 2 years ago. With the immediacy of so many things that we can now get, we have that same expectation and are disappointed and frustrated when we can't get them from our own insurance company. There's payer desire for value-based care. This is a really, really big driver, and I know that Kayla's going to touch on this a little bit later too, but the desire to move more swiftly from the traditional fee-for-service toward more complete value-based care continues to be a massive focus. It's probably been the single most talked about concept for the past decade in anyone in the healthcare industry. But for payers, one of their biggest impediments is the challenge of building a value-based care infrastructure that can actually support evaluating the data and paying on that basis. It is far more complex, I think, than anyone really appreciates. And you see these surveys every year. McKinsey has a value-based care study that comes out once a year and constantly reporting the lack of infrastructure particularly on the technology side, as being the biggest impediment to payers who aren't the huge payers. And at the same time, McKinsey and everyone else continues to report these staggering expectations of the number of patients that will be experiencing value-based care in the coming years. McKinsey's most recent one, February 2023, expects the number of patients to be part of a value-based care plan, whether or not they realize they are, which is another funny thing, to double between 2023 and 2028. And we've already made some moves. Other drivers are rapidly evolving regulation, like the No Surprises Act that payers have to be responsive to. Yes, that falls a lot on providers, but payers have a significant role. Payers need for increased efficiencies for both their internal operations, but their contractual obligations. The more that providers and beneficiaries have rights and expectations of the payers, the more they need support to fulfill those expectations. And then lastly, the desire for enhanced member and provider interfaces. A couple of transactions, some of these are not in the billion-dollar echelon stratospheres. I was intentional about finding some slightly down into the middle market. TPG acquisition of Claims X10, a claims management technology and analytics tool. That actually was a carve-out from when Optum merged with Change Healthcare. So obviously these big mergers often create carve-outs, as we mentioned with the Magellan Centene acquisition. In a little bit of a different vein, Nordic Capital, Insight Venture Management, and 22C Capital acquisition of Innovalin Holdings, which is a data platform focused on a variety of health outcomes. That was a big one, $7.3 billion. But there are others that are happening more in the middle market, because the beauty of IT services, of course, is there's all different sizes, shapes, and incredibly fragmented still. CityBlock Health, just to give you an example, it provides Medicaid plans in particular with a coordinated tech-enabled care program, and it raised $400 million in the late-stage investment round by SoftBank. So a little bit more venture, less private equity structured, but just to give an example of something slightly into the middle market. So let's talk about the key legal issues with IT services. So all of the foregoing legal issues that I had touched on, and then a few more that come up in particular for IT services companies. Offshoring legal considerations. It is increasingly common to see components of IT services provided offshore, and that raises implications both for contractual provisions. A lot of times, offshoring opportunities, including by subcontractors in the payer services space, can implement contractual arrangements, in particular in the plans. And then there are rapidly evolving laws on offshoring, from efforts at straight prohibition to at least putting in stricture and protections around offshoring. And then lastly, laws governing the use of artificial intelligence. And I'll let Kayla talk about this a little bit more, but obviously that is a huge component of what a lot of the IT services who serve payers are doing, is incorporating machine learning, artificial intelligence, and this is such a rapidly evolving area of law that we expect to change pretty much on a daily basis over the course of the next several years probably. And payer services solutions are no different than the rest of us trying to stay on top of those issues. So Kayla, I will let you take over on the remainder of the payer services subsectors.
Thanks, Amber. And I'm just going to pause for a moment before I go into these last two subsectors just to answer one of our questions that was submitted in the Q&A so far. One of the questions was, what subdivision do we think are most concentrated? So the smallest number of large vendors that hold the majority of the shares. I think that Amber touched on this earlier, but due to the nature of the business, it's likely going to be the ancillary benefit management subsectors. In IT services, medical review, and cost containment, we still see a pretty significant number of smaller players, and we're still seeing a significant number of smaller player transactions in the squarely middle market and lower middle market on the ancillary benefit management due to just the scale that's required to administer it. I think we're seeing that more among the larger players, upper middle market. So before we move into the next one, just wanted to answer that Q&A. Thank you guys for submitting them. Keep submitting them, and we'll hit them along the way. So the next topic area we're going to talk about is medical review services. Like we've talked about throughout the course of the webinar, this is a subdivision that is a little bit unique. So maybe let me explain what the subdivision is, and then we'll go into some of the market drivers. So primarily medical review are companies that assist payers in independent reviews of claims coverage or of medical appropriateness of particular services. So this is often a healthcare services intense subdivision of payer services, because the individuals who are making these assessments within the medical review organization do tend to be contracted physicians or other medical professionals based on the subsector. So this is one place that, for those of you that are familiar with the healthcare services space, there's a nice intersection here. So this, just like any of the other subsectors, continue to be a very attractive area for investment and for strategic and de novo growth. And there's a few market factors that are really continuing to drive this interest. So the first, similar to some of the things that Amber was talking about, is billing administration. If any of you are involved in a healthcare services business currently or invested in one currently, you know that billing payers, tracking claims, and ensuring appropriateness of claims is very difficult, very detailed, and maybe more challenging than it has ever been because of the necessity of sophisticated technology. There's been a couple of studies that have been done that we're aware of that show that billing administration and payer administration in the United States is sometimes 2 times, 3 times more complicated and time-consuming than in other countries that are similar to the United States around the world. So it continues to be an identified issue, especially for payers to navigate, and it is a huge resource suck for payers that make this a really important subdivision. There also are new technologies and new regulations at all times that make that administration even more difficult. So many of you that may work in this subdivision are aware that there's very detailed regulation at most state levels that we'll talk about here in a little bit that details patient rights around medical review. It details the process by which payers have to go through to complete appropriate medical reviews. And each payer, especially those operating in multiple states, have to be familiar with each of those unique laws, implement processes around those unique laws, which can be very time-consuming and also very expensive. And so that provides a real opportunity for medical review companies to come in and assist with that administration, particularly in the use of technology. So we're seeing that be a huge opportunity. As technology gets more sophisticated, as things like AI get more capable of assisting with certain types of medical review, there's a real opportunity for cost containment. So this is one of the places that medical review services are going to overlap with cost containment and with IT services for payers. So we're seeing an interest and continue to adopt sophisticated technology and the availability of sophisticated technology to help with these reviews. And that's somewhere we haven't necessarily been in the past. There's been technology available, but not to the level that it currently is today. So that's another market driver. The last thing that I think is really interesting is the demand for objective treatment of similar claims. And this demand is coming from a few different places. So it's coming, number one, from patients, from consumers. Their expectation is in connection with medical reviews, payers are treating them the same as other individuals who have similar conditions under similar plans. Number two, employers. So people that are consuming and contracting with plans expect this on behalf of their employees and are demanding it, and so payers are trying to respond to that consumer. And then third, regulatory and governmental bodies. There has been a very significant focus, like I was saying earlier, on patient rights and same treatment of similar conditions under similar plans. And so that's an area that we think will continue to be an area of state law and federal law focus, and therefore payer investment in that area is critical, especially when there is objective metrics that can be looked to. Just like any of the other subdivisions, there are several notable transactions that have been happening in the space. One is very recent. So you may have heard of MD Panel. On October 10th, Aquiline Capital Partners launched MD Panel. It's going to be a platform that's dedicated to delivery of medical opinions in connection with workers' compensation insurance claim processes. So it is not always a scenario that medical review companies are serving traditional fee-for-service payer plans. They're also serving areas like workers' compensation claims. And it's very interesting, many of you may be familiar, but California Medical Legal Specialists and California Medical Evaluators are two companies that have been in the space for a long time supporting physicians performing these qualified medical evaluations, specifically for workers' compensation claims. And they actually have joined a part of MD Panel quite recently, and now they're going to serve about 250 sites and are doing about 1 million valuations on an annual basis in a lot of different subspecialties, including orthopedics, pain management, chiropractic, internal medicine. So it's a very late-breaking development. There's a couple of other acquisitions that have also happened that are notable that may be interesting. So KPRO acquired assets of the Independent Medical Expert Consulting Services. So that's just an independent medical review company, like I was describing, that provides services to payers for peer review, external appeals, and dispute resolution. That transaction made them one of the largest quality improvement organizations in the country serving payers. And then the last, just of note, is Claims Resolution Corporation's investment by Ardent Investors. That's a more traditional private equity-esque play to invest where they're infusing capital into CRC and then also expanding workers' compensation liabilities for claims for governmental entities and then in a specific region. So in that case, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York, where they're serving those medical review capabilities. The next are just some of the specific laws that are impacting medical review services. Amber's touched on some of these, although there's a little bit of a different flavor when we're talking about medical review laws. So the first is data privacy laws. So as you may expect, in connection with independent medical reviews or medical review companies, a significant part of their business is reviewing data for payers that have been shared by patients or healthcare providers. There is always a need to make sure that there is accurate security of PHI and PII under data privacy and HIPAA laws whenever there is a transfer of that information from a payer to an external medical review company. And so in connection with various transactions, we've seen a significant focus on data security in ways that we don't always see in other transactions in the healthcare sector, because there is the regular movement of patient and personal information during these reviews. So that's something to be particularly sensitive about. Those laws are not typically different for medical review companies than they are for other providers, payers, and healthcare services companies, but there is a significant flow of information that you just need to be very, very cognizant of. And we often see enhanced data security investigations in connection with transactions to ensure that whenever there is data flowing between the parties, the ability for a security incident is low. We often see increased cyber coverage, things like that, in connection with transactions. I've touched on this a couple of times when I was talking about the key market drivers, but the IRO and peer review laws, like I mentioned, nearly every U.S. state at this point has independent review laws to ensure equal application of insurance coverage to patients. And then the failure to comply with those does have pretty severe penalties for payers. So to the extent that they're utilizing a third-party company, and in many cases they're required to by state law, it is very important that they are vetting that process, implementing it appropriately, and not putting themselves in a position where there is potential liability. So that's a point that's probably the single most important subset of laws that we see as an area of focus. The next are federal and state laws. This is one of the only subdivisions of payer services that we see a heavy hand by healthcare providers. Nearly every medical review company needs to contract with third-party healthcare providers to provide the independent medical review services. And so just like any time in a healthcare services business, when you're contracting with providers, there's a significant number of state and federal laws that are implicated, some of which are fraud and abuse laws. We've seen an increased focus on that, particularly when payers also have healthcare services arms that may have relationship with those same group of physicians that are providing services to the medical review components of their business or to their medical review companies that are contracted with them. So always be aware, as a good rule of thumb, to have fair market value, commercially reasonable relationships with those healthcare providers, even if they're only providing medical review services. It's just a good practice. And then the last legal point before we move on to our last subsector is on offshoring. Amber already touched on this a fair amount, but for medical review companies, there's a even heightened level of considerations for offshoring. In medical review organizations, like we talked about, there's a significant amount of PII and PHI that is shared between payers and medical review companies. We have seen an increase in the number of medical review companies that are offshoring certain types of services. It is still a consideration whether or not all services can be offshored, or even all subsets of services can be offshored due to the sensitive information that is being provided, like PHI and PII. So that has to be checked based on the type of medical review that is being completed and the service the medical review company is doing. So this is a really good example of a circumstance with a single payer services company could have different arms, IT services, cost containment, and, for example, medical review. And perhaps medical review would not be appropriate to be offshored, but it would be appropriate, for example, to have IT services offshored. So just being really, really mindful of that is very important. Our last topic subdivision is cost containment solutions. This has been one of the single most attractive subsectors for payers for obvious reasons. Cost containment drops immediately to payers' bottom lines. So that has been an area of focus for a long time, and this is one of the most developed subsectors of payer services, but it still has a lot of growth, still has a lot of tailwinds from our perspective. So what is cost containment? Cost containment is essentially any service that makes payers more efficient, reduces utilization by patients, or otherwise saves costs. So we're going to go through some of the drivers and opportunities, and I'm going to try to highlight some key items that we see happening from a cost containment perspective. So like we talked about, there is a desire to see immediate cost reduction, particularly as the curve for trend of healthcare costs continues to go up. There's a lot of pressure by payers to reduce that cost, as especially administrative costs, because like we talked about under the medical review section, administrative costs are estimated to be twice and then sometimes 3 times that of our peer countries. So that's not the healthcare service itself, that's just the administration of the healthcare service. So there's a lot of demand to reduce that cost. There's also a lot of opportunities for advances in technology to facilitate cost savings and then streamlining automation. There's 2 really good examples of that we see in the market. First is AI related to claim submission, interfacing with particular healthcare providers, more quickly administering claims that historically had to be manual individuals to administer, things that are just process points, for lack of better name. And then the second is on telemedicine. So there's a huge ability for telemedicine to fill a gap that wasn't previously available prior to COVID. There's been a significant amount of investment in telemedicine, which increases, in many cases, access to care as a supplement, of course, to general in-person healthcare services. We're never going to get to a place, I don't think, that will not have any healthcare in person, but telemedicine can be another tool to payers in their arsenal. The other is pressures from employer to reduce the cost of healthcare policies. So it is increasing that there are employer-funded healthcare plans that is making employers more cost-conscious than individual consumers have been able to be in the past. That pressure on who to choose as your particular plan administrator is putting pressure on payers to reduce administrative burden to be more competitive in the marketplace. There's also been a focus on fraud. So cost containment can also come in the form of fraud prevention. How are payers determining whether or not there's significant fraud in the marketplace and the way in which they can reduce that fraud and therefore reduce their cost? That has been an area that's been a significant focus of the federal government, and payers have continued to focus on it as well. And they've been using cost containment tools to fight that fraud. It often is low-hanging fruit for them. The last thing I thought was kind of interesting as we've looked at different cost containment solutions, and as Amber mentioned with respect to the move to value-based care, a lot of the demands are about predicting future healthcare costs. So the way that you would contain a cost is try to determine what it is, budget for it, and make changes in your ultimate business model to try to reduce that cost in the future. So we are seeing a significant investment in value-based care opportunities, a significant investment in data forecasting, and many payers have some of the best data in the entire healthcare industry to be in a position to forecast costs and then try to head off some of the drivers of those costs in advance. So that's another item that's made cost containment very attractive. The transactions in this space tend to be fairly significant. The biggest probably being Change Healthcare's acquisition by Optum, which Amber mentioned, one of the spinoff transactions earlier. I think that transaction is particularly interesting because it really shows the interest of both providers and payers in these various solutions. And I think we're going to continue to see that throughout the evolution of payer services. There's going to continue to be the intersection of healthcare services, payers, consumers, and then other service companies. So I thought that was particularly interesting myself. The next is Omega Healthcare acquired Axiom Health. This was really to help eliminate management costs and accelerate cash flow. They're in themselves a technology company that has advantages in automation, machine learning, and other technology innovations. And those innovations are aimed at reducing administrative burden and therefore reducing overall costs. So very similar themes to what we've seen in several of the other subsectors in this one. There are some different laws that have been implicated in this subsector than in others. The first being telemedicine laws. So like I mentioned earlier, one of the primary drivers of cost containment solutions is the expansion of telehealth. It's being offered, of course, to deliver care, things like colds, preventative care, determining diabetes management, medication management, things like that, and then also to monitor patients on an ongoing basis. And that driver by payers has been often in situations to deal with cost containment. Like I mentioned, COVID drove a really significant demand on the adoption of telehealth, but it also brought a lot more regulation of telehealth. Many states now have specific position statements relating to telehealth that anyone working in the space should be very aware of, and specifically around audio and visual capabilities and the regulation of when to incentivize and when not to incentivize telehealth and the appropriateness of it, particularly for cost containment. And this has been really important to monitor on a consistent and ongoing basis, because what we have noticed is there are many changes to the telehealth laws during COVID and after COVID, some of which are no longer in effect. So very important to stay up to date on that and understand as a payer services company when you can assist with telehealth and when you cannot. The next is AI. We've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it has garnered a lot of attention from the state and the federal government. We expect to see a continued pressure on when it is ethical and appropriate for payers to utilize AI for cost containment, whether it be to analyze patient populations and predict costs and predict utilization, or if it is actually to administer claims processes and things of the like. So look for that to be an area of constant change, just like Amber said. And currently, the most major consideration is the permission to load data and train AI on particular services. So as a payer services company, it's going to be really important to know whether or not that company is implementing AI solutions using data that they receive from payers, patients, or other sources, and make sure the use of that data is appropriate before using it to train AI. The next thing, which is interesting, is state insurance and TPA laws. So one of the major ways that payers are addressing cost containment is through high deductible insurance plans. Many of those high deductible plans and other insurance products are administered by TPAs. If you've worked in the healthcare services arena in the past, the primary laws that you've interfaced with at the state level are likely corporate practice of medicine laws, fraud and abuse laws, licensure laws, things like that, everything that is sitting under the Department of Health. Like Amber mentioned, when you delve into the payer services world, if you haven't already, then you're going to see that there's a whole new set of laws, particularly around state insurance regulation. And if you are working on a cost containment solution that involves a TPA or other management associated with a TPA, you're going to see that the state insurance laws are going to be the primary area that you really need to focus to ensure that your company is in compliance, or your target company that you're buying is in compliance, because in many circumstances the state laws are different. In many circumstances they're extremely detailed, so it's something that you really need to be on the lookout for. Another area of cost containment that has been of interest to payer services companies is population health initiatives. So population health initiatives, everybody probably knows, is aimed at really attacking the social determinants of health and attacking some of the underlying issues that drive utilization and payer spend. So those could be things like availability of good food, preventative care, and other issues that drive patient spend and utilization. In that circumstance, when there are cost containment opportunities around population health, we are often dealing with patient inducement laws. So what expenditures can be made, what programs can be put in place by cost containment companies for payers that aim to reduce utilization. And to the extent that there is items giving of no value to patients, patient inducement laws need to be looked at and considered, whether it's part of the patient's plan, whether it's not part of the patient's plan, how providers are getting involved in that process and that population health initiative and how they're being paid, all implicates patient inducement laws, and then in some cases, state and federal fraud and abuse laws. So to the extent that your company or your target is using population health initiatives, that's something to be very mindful of and something to be laser focused on. And then the last, before we wrap up here, is price transparency requirements. So Amber mentioned earlier the No Surprises Act, which has been an area of focus of many healthcare services providers, but it actually is also important for payer services companies, particularly those that are involved in high deductible plans. Because high deductible plans often force patients, employers, and others to make certain decisions related to the cost of healthcare and closer align payers' goals with patients and employers' goals for their employees. So anytime there are price transparency laws, it's always important for the payer services companies, specifically those in cost containment, to be aware of those laws and be aware of how those laws may change behavior, especially utilization in connection with their plans. That helps with forecasting. It also helps with certain types of incentives that payers can include in their services relationships to try to drive appropriate clinical decision making, but also decrease overall utilization. So that's all that we were planning to talk about with respect to each of these subsectors. We really appreciate everyone continuing to stick with us here, ask really great questions. Amber, I don't know if you had anything else to add before we wrap up, but just wanted to give you an opportunity.
Well, I will just very quickly, since we have a couple more minutes, I will actually answer one more of the questions that was posed. This was a good question that asked us to comment on whether we're seeing a market trend toward players becoming one-stop shops or remaining as point solutions for providers. So I think that's a great question. We are still seeing both. Certainly a lot of the add-on activity has been to expand the service offerings that a particular company can make to its payer clients, more or less. So a lot of that add-on activity has been around becoming more of that one-stop shop. There's a lot of activity, there's still a lot of fragmentation, but those add-ons have been really interesting. So I'll give you one example. In the traditional private equity world, Thompson Street Capital, private equity fund based in St. Louis, investor in Data Dimensions. And Data Dimensions add-ons have been to expand its existing clearinghouse technology services solutions for insurers to other things. So they acquired a digital mailroom company. They acquired Provider Flow to expand the service offerings. And that's actually not dissimilar from a different lens to when Prime Therapeutics bought the Centene spin-out of Magellan RX. In that way, they weren't necessarily expanding the services provided as much as the subsector served. That was more of a behavioral health play. But I think we're going to continue to really see both of these things happen. Point solutions develop, but point solutions be acquisition opportunities for the players who want to be more of the one-stop shop. So great question. And I think that is a great way to wrap us up. Sorry for those of you that we didn't get to the other questions. There were some really good ones posed, and we will follow up with you as some of our takeaways. Thank you.